Hello Year 12 and welcome to this pre-recorded lesson. Hopefully you've just joined me from the Teams register and do it now. As I said in that little meeting, you'll need your paper and pen ready today to take some notes, and there will be a chance for you to feedback and have a little text-based chat and discussion once you finish this recording. Remember that you can pause this, rewind it and go back and watch it at any point should you need to. It's always going to be there on hand for you to revise from. So today we're looking at chapter 3 of Dorian Gray. You should have read this chapter before you tackle this lesson so that it all makes sense, and you'll need a copy of the text next to you as you go through these slides, because I'm going to ask you to pick out certain bits and have a reread and consider certain elements. Our objective today is to mainly consider the interactions between characters in the text, particularly Lord Henry and Dorian himself. We're also going to take a look at, in brief, a couple of the side characters and what they say in terms of their position within the aristocracy and presentations of the aristocracy itself. So we've got quite a lot to take notes on today. Let's get going. So you'll find that most of this chapter focuses on the aristocracy. It's the wealthy upper classes of British society. We know that there are several sort of name-dropped places within London. There are a few here that you might want to take note of. If you've got a question in your exam on setting, then it might be useful to just take a note of the changing parts of London and the different areas of London that are mentioned within the text. Those of you that have got the Penguin Classics version of the text, you'll see that there are footnotes for a lot of these settings as well. So you've got a little explanation of where they are at the back of the novel as well. Basically, all these places, Curzon Street, Albany, Berkeley Square, Willis's Rooms, these are very fashionable, very upper class areas of London where the wealthy will live in London when they're not in their country homes. So we get this sense of snobbery. Now, initially in the chapter, we see Lord Henry go to his uncle, Lord Fermor, and they have a discussion around Dorian's family. So I just want you to find that part of the text for a second and think about these two key questions. How is snobbery, this sense of snobbery, demonstrated in the history of Dorian's family, particularly with focus on his mother? And how is it demonstrated through Henry's uncle, with one key quote there, "If a man is a gentleman, he knows quite enough." So just pause the video and then we'll come back together and I'll explain to you what I think. So in terms of Dorian's family, and a focus on Dorian's mother in particular, you should have spotted that the family considered her to have married down, married beneath her. She marries a soldier of no real rank or standing in the British Army, and her family almost disown her for this. It's important to remember that she marries out of love, and there is a mirror there, a little comparison to what Dorian does later on with Sybil Vane. The family then obviously engineer a situation where they are able to get rid of her husband. The father, Dorian's grandfather, arranges for a man to fight his father and kill him in a duel. Then Dorian's mum is obviously left by herself. She then dies soon after, leaving Dorian orphaned. For the second question, Lord Fermor, who states, "If a man is a gentleman, he knows quite enough." He seems to think very little of education. He seems to think that if you're born into the correct family, if you are a gentleman, then that's quite enough for you, and that if you're not a gentleman, if you're not born into the right family, then you're never going to be enough. It's never going to be enough for you to be able to have any of these higher positions of power or anything like that. So we certainly get this idea of snobbery within the upper classes. Remembering that this is all through Wilde's point of view. This is Wilde's lens on the world. So maybe these are Oscar Wilde's thoughts on the upper classes that he himself was involved with at the time. We also see for certain parts of the chapter, Lord Henry and his own relationship to wealth. So we learn from chapter 1 that he is not the chief inheritor of his family estate. That would be his older brother Dartmoor. But we do learn now that he is taking advantage of his position and essentially linking his debts with his brother's in the hope that Dartmoor will pay off his debts. So he uses the same suppliers, he uses the same shops and things like that. We also get this sense of resentment. He's clearly a bored man. He doesn't have any real role within society, and this is what might make him what's called a malcontent, someone who is very clever, very intelligent, but that he's got the means to just cause a little bit of mischief in the world just because he can, just because he has the means to do so. Here's a section of the text. You'll find this about midway through chapter 2, maybe about 3/4 of the way through. It's during the discussion of the poor in London, when Lord Henry has gone to Lady Agatha's house. Dorian is there, and they're discussing what to do about the poor areas of London. I just want you to find this section, and I want you to have a reread of it. And then there's one key question for you down the bottom. So what is significant about the help that Dorian and Lady Agatha are giving in the East End? So see if you can pick out any interesting parts of this particular section of the text. So this is not every idea. This is not an exhaustive list of ideas within this part of the text. But we can see that Lady Agatha and Dorian, mainly Lady Agatha, think that they can help the people of the East End, a very poor area of London, by playing piano to them, and that they're unhappy in Whitechapel, which again is a part of the East End, and that the way to solve this, the upper classes see that playing the piano to them is an adequate way of doing that. Now remember that this text is written in the late 1800s. This is before anything like the welfare state. Those of you that can remember some of the issues that are raised in Inspector Calls about looking after people, that one's set in 1912, and that's just after the time of Dorian Gray. So we're in a similar sort of situation here. We've got an upper class who have absolutely no idea of the situation and the struggles of a lower class. They're completely detached from it. We then get some of Lord Henry's words. The idea of suffering is too ugly, too horrible, too distressing. There's something terribly morbid in the modern sympathy with pain. And Lord Henry here is showing his aesthetic point of view. One should sympathise with the colour, the beauty, the joy of life. The less said about life's sores, the better. And that takes us into this idea of asceticism, that things should be judged on their ability to be beautiful, not on any sort of moral grounds or grounds of usefulness. Now, through Lord Henry's aesthetic eyes, he possibly sees the working classes and the lower classes as people to be ignored because they are in pain, because they're suffering, and because that makes them ugly and horrible and distressing, in Lord Henry's words. He then goes on, you see, to call them slaves. He says that the problem of the East End is the problem of slavery, and we try to solve it by amusing the slaves. And this sort of language really shows us the darker face of Lord Henry. It shows us the man that he truly is when he's in private, when he's simply amongst his friends. There's also another highlight that I've made a different colour there because I think it gives us a different idea. Lord Henry says that we should appeal to science to put us straight. And we know, again from our readings from GCSE level, from Jekyll and Hyde, and also Dracula early on, that this is a time where Darwinism is coming to the forefront of people's minds, that especially in the upper classes there was this, not obsession, but certainly interest with ideas like evolution and what's called social Darwinism, which I'll get to in a couple of slides' time. So we certainly see here that Lord Henry especially, he has quite a dark, quite a harsh view of anyone that's beneath him in the world. He sees himself as someone who comes from a position of beauty, a position of the colour and the joy of life, and the less said about these life sores the better. He doesn't really want to be discussing the lower classes. Now this is quite an interesting article that I found for you. I will send you a link to it within the chat. It's by Greg Buswell. It's on the British Library, and this links to what we've just talked about in terms of Lord Henry's two faces, his almost like happy, his cheeky chappy sort of personality when he's in public or when he's with his friends, and then his true mask that he lets slip within this particular scene. So we know that the literature of the time period, the fin de siècle, explored the darkest recesses of Victorian society and the often disturbing private desires that lurked behind acceptable public faces. That's certainly a quote from Boswell there that we can apply to Lord Henry in this position. And then this little link to Asceticism, the controversial theory that art was newly fashionable, of art that was newly fashionable at this time, was that art should be judged purely by its beauty. And this is exactly what Lord Henry is doing here. There are plenty of other little tidbits that you could pull out of that article, and like I said, I'll put the link to it in our chat while you're watching this video, so you've got it there to have a read of later on. I think we should also be in mind now of Darwinism, and of especially the subset of Darwinism, or this smaller idea called social Darwinism. And I think we can see Lord Henry here as a social Darwinist. He says we should appeal to science to put us straight. Now, that to me says that he believes in this idea of social Darwinism. It's that society itself, so the way that we live, the classes that we put ourselves in, are governed by the same laws of evolution that Darwin observed in animals. So it essentially means that if you are well off in the world, if you are doing well, if you are flourishing, then you're justified as being doing so because you're fit for society. You've been put in a position where you are doing well. Whereas the weak, the lower classes in society, those that are suffering, well, they're intended to perish. They should be suffering, and they should be, dying in droves and things like that. Because, well, that's just Darwinism. That's science. We've been sorted out. We are separating the strong from the weak. We can see this sort of feeling within Lord Henry's words here. And it could be that later on in the text we see those sorts of feelings repeat again or are reflected within Dorian's actions and words. So we need to keep this in mind. The image that I've linked here is a picture called the Nemesis of Neglect. It appeared in a Punch cartoon, which was a little comic book, that sort of thing, news for people. It appeared in the 1890s, around about the same time that Jack the Ripper was doing his business around the East End of London. And the text beneath it that I've linked for you here, there floats a phantom on the slum's foul air, shaping to eyes which have the gift of seeing into the spectre of that loathly lair. Face it, for vain is fleeing, red-handed, ruthless, furtive, unerect, 'tis murderous crime, the nemesis of neglect. Now this kind of reflects a Victorian attitude at the time, that people like Jack the Ripper were coming out of the woodwork, was sort of starting to be active because of the state of some parts of London, that it was the neglect of those east ends of London that led to people like Jack the Ripper coming out in force. So there was concern within some of the upper classes that their actions, or their lack of action in helping those who were less fortunate, led to people like Jack the Ripper. But maybe this is not shared, or an opinion shared by Lord Henry. He might say something like that science has made it this way. We should appeal to science to put us straight. That if this is what's happening to the lower classes, then perhaps that is right. That is what is intended to be. Very interesting points on Lord Henry's perspectives on the world there. And then we see Lord Henry start to influence Dorian. So we see Dorian Gray essentially the minute that Lord Henry arrives at Lady Agatha's house. We see Dorian flush with pleasure into his cheeks, and we obviously know through our reading of Dracula that any mention of blood in the cheeks or a flush, that sort of thing, is a kind of reference to sexuality or sexual attraction in some way. Just pause the video for a second here, take a look at this little paragraph that I've quoted for you in the white box, see if you can pick out a few more little bits and pieces that you might be able to quote and show their relationship with each other. So, like I said, there are probably a few more ideas here, but here's a couple for you. The idea of Lord Henry charming his listeners out of themselves, and they followed his pipe laughing, evokes this imagery of the Pied Piper and how people are powerless to resist Henry's charms. They are following him along, that clear influence that he has over people. And then Dorian again sat like one under a spell. This idea of the supernatural coming into play here. We've already discussed within chapter 2 the idea of Lord Henry being maybe like a devil character, a Satan type character, and here again is another little link to the supernatural. We've also got reference to two body parts of Dorian's, his lips and his eyes. I don't think these lips are as sexualized as the lips that are mentioned within Dracula, but it's still interesting that Oscar Wilde chooses to focus on the lips as an object of, an obvious image of desire there for Dorian and Henry together. So, as the chapter continues, we start to see Henry's thoughts on what he can actually do for Dorian, or even do to Dorian, during their relationship, their friendship. It's interesting that in chapter 3 he says that Dorian is a marvellous type, or could be fashioned into a marvellous type at any rate. So he clearly believes now that he has the opportunity to mould Dorian into someone who kind of reflects Henry's own views and attitudes towards life. But in the second chapter, if we turn back for a second, he says, one of the very first things he says to Dorian is that there's no such thing as good influence, Mr. Grey. All influence is immoral from a scientific point of view. There's his idea of Darwinism coming out again. So I guess the question is, which side does Lord Henry truly believe? Does he believe that influence is all immoral and that he shouldn't influence Dorian? Or does he believe that he has this good opportunity here to put some influence onto Dorian and to mould him into something that he believes is right? Or does he believe both? Does he know, or does he think that influence is immoral but he's going to do it anyway? That would certainly fit our image of Henry as this Satan type character, that he knows what he's doing is wrong but that he's going to do it anyway. Like we said before, Oscar Wilde doesn't see this novel as giving you any particular moral message. It's up to you to respond and to reflect upon the characters yourself. Whatever decisions you come up with about these characters, it says more about you as a reader than it does about the literature itself. So you might have some different ideas about Lord Henry when we come to discussing him later on in the chat. Finally, here's an interesting fact for you about this particular part of Dorian Gray. There are 5 chapters in this novel that weren't in the initial publication when this was published in Lippincott's magazine. This is the first of them. So this chapter was added for second editions and editions going forward by Oscar Wilde, and obviously he's done that for a particular reason. So when you come back to the chat, my first question to you is going to be this: what is the purpose of this chapter? What does Oscar Wilde want to tell us about these two men, particularly about Lord Henry, and why does Oscar Wilde want to give us these particular messages? So, like I said earlier, feel free to rewind and take your own notes on this video as and when you need, and I'll see you back in the chat so we can have a discussion on a few key questions. Thanks, Year 12.